Okay, this is going to be a response to An00bis 2814. Unfortunately, An00bis packs so many falsehoods so densely that it's going to take much more time to respond to them than it took him to make them. So let's just get into it.
Prior to the Industrial Revolution in America, a boom in prosperity with a new concept called laissez-faire capitalism emerged. That is assuming you weren't a Native American, Black, or Chinese, of course. Even if you were Irish, Italian, Jewish, or German, you were treated badly for a few generations. This was a step up from basically everyone being a slave under a rich lord to white people being free at the expense of other groups.
Okay, which white people? Slavery had to be enforced by slave patrols, right? And that is, poor white farmers were conscripted to go hunt down escaped slaves and have them be brought back, while the few owners of slaves were the one who reaped the benefits from this situation. Moreover, in slave states, it made more short-term sense to invest in slaves than in taking a risk in industry. And many have postulated that slavery prevented an industrial revolution in Rome and limited the industrialization of major slave states in the U.S. So it is not at all clear that white people in the aggregate were benefiting from slavery. So to say that whites benefited at the expense of black slaves, among the other people you listed off, is a stretch. Okay. As for benefiting at the expense of Native Americans, maybe that would make sense if you believe that the Native Americans owned all of this land and that it was taken from them. I don't. Right? If some guy goes up into the hills and just hunts them, kills a few buffalo or whatever, right, does that mean he owns all of those hills? Okay. Now, ownership is inherently subjective, right? It's all a matter of opinion, but we can safely say that that criteria of ownership is absurd. It's just as absurd as some man coming along proclaiming himself the state and then claiming, as far as the eye can see as his land, and say, well, if you want to live in this area, you have to do what I say and pay the fees that I want. If you don't like it, then you can leave, because I claim this land, right? It's about as dumb as that, right? Native American land claims are about as absurd as a state's land claim. But I'm giving you a little bit too much. I don't think you even know what you're talking about. I don't even think you have any idea why, like, whites were benefiting at the expense of these other people, right? These are just cliche assertions. Like, the simplest explanation is that you don't have any rationalization, that you're just parroting cliche assertions.
We reshaped the land. A forested and plains land became farms and fields. More former serfs now had the ability to read and go to school. With this higher number of thinking and creative minds opening up, new inventions began to be designed. When education and knowledge and learning was hoarded by the wealthy and powerful, its growth was very slow. Once more people could get that information and education, prosperity exploded.
I agree with this, right? Increased productivity led to people not having to spend as much time working, and so they could spend more time investing or learning, right? And so kids didn't have to work as much, and so they could go to school. Now, a quick preempt to the dumb argument that the reason kids went to school is because of child labor laws. The decline in child labor was largely unaffected by the laws restricting it. Link in the description on that. That is, child labor was already greatly on the decline by the time the laws were put in place. And the reason it was on the decline was because parents were becoming more productive, and it was no longer necessary to require their children to work, and so their children could be sent to school instead. As for parents who were still so poor that they absolutely needed the children to continue working, the children continued to work despite the child labor laws. Right? The child labor laws had no effect on this.
Awareness increased and more rights opened up to varying groups slowly. With this new innovation, a new form of production came about. The Industrial Revolution picked up. No longer were things powered just by water, wind, and animal labor. Things you bought were not made by hand. They were made in factories that burnt coal and were lighted by kerosene.
I don't know what you're trying to get at, but just for the record, public schooling didn't exist in Britain until 1870, and the Industrial Revolution is generally agreed to have begun in the 1780s in Britain. So if you are trying to claim that mandatory state-run schooling caused industrialization, this is pretty much impossible. I don't know if that's what you're trying to say, It seems like you're trying to imply that without coming out and actually say that. But if you're trying to imply that, then that's just matter-of-factly false.
The Luddites rebelled and protested this new change as their craft was dying, but in the end they had to give up their skills and go work for someone wealthy with the means of production. These wealthy, for the first time, now did not have to rely on the land to sustain them. They could just go live somewhere else. They stripped mine, used child and unsafe labor, and paid their new unskilled labor pennies on the dollar for what they were worth.
Okay, 3 assertions here that need to be dealt with. First off, again, child labor. Now, in most of human history, quote, child labor, close quote, was never an issue because it wasn't called child labor. It was just called life. Okay, what these early factories did is they gave children a better deal than, say, working on a pre-industrial farm, which is a horrible experience, okay, or better yet, working as a child prostitute or working in one of those god-awful orphanage, or living in one of those god-awful orphanages. Okay, so what you're doing here, Mr. An00bis, is you're chastising these industries for what? For not completely abolishing child labor straight away when child labor had been the norm for all of history up to that point? Again, these are just more of your cliche assertions. Second off, firms don't profit from having injured workers. Okay? Injured workers have to be replaced. And while they probably are replaced, I mean, just about everyone is replaceable, but it's not instant. New people have to be trained and worked in, and it's a pain and it costs money. Injuries cost money. And so these factories have a financial stake in preventing injury. So even if you believe that these capitalists have zero empathy for their employees, which is, a monstrous demonization that I don't buy into, but, even if you do believe that, then they still have a financial incentive to limit injuries. Now, some people may ask, well, why were there a lot more injuries on the job than there are today? Well, there are also more injuries back then just from living life than there are today. Like everything was more dangerous because technology wasn't as good. Like that's just how it was. Third off, the after-tax margins in industry since around 1950 have been about 6%. And much of that 6% is reinvested. Right? Very little of it goes to the actual consumption, the gluttony of consumption of the capitalists. Like, I mean, there's so few of them that, it makes good propaganda to show them having these lavish parties, the parties in the sky or whatever. But like as a percentage of total consumption, it's minuscule. And most of the profit that is earned, it actually goes back to either being reinvested in new factories, going to small-time shareholders, or, going to new foundations or whatever. It doesn't, very little of it goes to these absurd consumptions. Now, I don't have any data on how much firms earned in profit in around, say, 1800, but I have no reason to believe that it's much higher than today. Okay. Now, the capitalist is just a worker, and the profit, or loss, is his wage, depending on how effective he is in managing the structure of production. There's nothing inherently undue about the wage that the capitalist earns in the form of profit. Okay? Now, maybe you think that 6% is too much. I don't know what that would even mean. He's being paid too much. Like, what do you know? Okay? But to say people were being paid, quote, pennies on the dollar of what their labor is worth is just asinine, right? I mean, there's only, let's be generous. Let's say there's 10%. There's 10% profit around 1800. All right, that's it. All right, there's 10% going to the capitalists. All right, and so even if you assume that all of that is completely ill-gotten gains, right? It's not like he's paying other people, the workers in the factory, and plus paying for all the raw materials that is going to the miners and stuff for all the materials for all the products, right? That's still 90%, right? So it's not pennies on the dollar, as you say. And fourth off, what the hell do you know about what their labor is worth, right? How much is scrubbing desks worth, right? I mean, there is no objective value to any labor. Like, the only value that something has is what it can be exchanged for. Now, and moreover, this is where it gets really absurd. The only reason that the labor of all these workers produces so much is because of the structure of production engineered by the capitalists themselves. Okay, so like it is the capitalists themselves that made these people's labor be so productive, right? And the capitalists are taking a little bit of profit from that, right? And that profit is their wage for successfully managing the structure of production. Now, if the capitalist is taking too much from his firm and is not reinvesting it or whatever, then what that does is that puts his competitors at an advantage, and he will go out of business. And so as you have competition between firms, there is a natural regulatory mechanism against individual capitalists engorging in these orgies of consumption.
They pumped out smoke to be breathed by city dwellers and poured chemicals in the rivers and streams.
Pollution. I'm going to outsource this. Linked is an excellent piece on pollution during the Industrial Revolution. But to paraphrase and to generalize, in the 1830s and 1840s, people would sue factories for their pollution on the grounds that pollution is a violation of property rights. For example, if you're dumping stuff into a river, that river gets into the groundwater, it affects the crops of other people, it affects the fishing of the people's property plots adjacent to the river. Air pollution, obviously that trespasses all sorts of people's property, right? And so pollution was originally treated as a property rights violation. Over time, however, the state courts began to side with the factory owners, right? My guess is because they were bribed, okay? And so private property was not upheld, and so these factories could pollute. And so the massive industrial pollution can be seen as a failure, as a result of the failure of the state to uphold property rights that would have said, hey, like if you want to pollute, you're going to have to either, you're going to have to reimburse all these people, pay them whatever fee that they demand for trespassing, or you're going to have to find a way to not pollute.
The people getting by now didn't have time or money to get their children educated even to a 6th grade level.
The Industrial Revolution is generally agreed to have occurred in the U.S. between 1820 and 1870, and if you look at the hours worked per week by people in the U.S., linked in the description, you'll see that from 1830 to today, that number has been going down steadily, and we can only assume that this trend extends back to 1820. There is no evidence that people had to spend more time working during industrialization. We also know that their real wages also increased despite working fewer hours, again, link in the description. So no, during the Industrial Revolution, 1. Hours worked decreased. 2. Real wages increased despite less hours being worked. And 3. A greater percentage of children were going to school. None of the things that you said in this little section are true.